just in time.
Well, thank you very much, Arie. Thank you very much to everybody here in the room for joining us for this plenary. I'm really honored to say goodbye today to you. And in the 10 minutes that I've been allotted to say goodbye, I just want to say thank you for having been able to serve for the last 4 years as the first president, the former first president of WISC. This has been indeed a great honor because I've always looked at WISC as, well, a sort of equivalent of the United Nations in the world of states. It would have had to be invented if it had not existed, because the whole of states needs an overarching institutional framework, as no single state or grouping of states can claim the legitimacy bestowed in a representative institutional expression of the whole, such as the United Nations, as weak as it may be in the daily operations of regulating competition between states. In that sense, I always felt that WISC is sort of a weak equivalent of the UN. Let me start my farewell message, first of all, with congratulations to my successor as president of WISC, Professor Pinar Bilgin. Arie, Kacowicz already mentioned it. I'm really extremely happy and very grateful to you, Pinar, that you were willing to stand for elections for a position for which, as I said yesterday, there were no volunteers. I'm all the more grateful since you reminded me yesterday and the members in the General Assembly that you did not volunteer either, that you are willing to be drafted, so to say, because of a great team that you were joining in terms of the governing board. I'm convinced, I'm very convinced that all colleagues around the world who know you agree that you couldn't have thought of a more qualified person to take over the WISC presidency. You are an outstanding, globally recognized scholar. You are connected extremely well all over the globe, and your background suits you better than almost anybody else to lead this association for the next few years. Second, let me briefly reflect on my own journey as it relates to WISC. It started sometime, I think, around 2005 as a representative of the German Association of Political Science, when I was participating, as many other colleagues at that time, at meetings which John Groom organized in the context of annual conventions of ISA. John Groom and Barry Buzan, who is joining us today, I'm grateful, Barry, that you could arrange that, are the two honorary members of WISC, and they both have been instrumental in creating this loose network initially of international studies associations. The other individual who deserves to be mentioned by name in this context is Tom Volji, ISA's former executive director, who made ISA's presidential suite available every year to meet for a long time before WISC was actually able to organize for itself. Third, Bojko Bučar, my immediate predecessor as executive secretary of WISC, is the third person to thank, because Bojko was carrying responsibility at the helm of WISC for much longer than he had actually planned. Roughly from 2008 until 2014, when we exchanged positions as executive secretary and associate executive secretary. We came to know each other some time around 2011, when I noticed a call for hosts, as it is used to be called and still is called, for bids to take over responsibility as a local organizer of WISC's Global International Studies Conferences. Those happen to take place every 3 years and still do so on a regular basis if things don't intervene, like the pandemic in the last few months. And I was willing to do so to host in a bid for the 4th Global International Studies Conference to be held in 2014, after the 3 prior conferences in Istanbul, Ljubljana, and Porto. And Knut-Erik Jørgensen, who joined us today, has been, I think, the program chair for the Ljubljana conference, among others. Since I liked the very idea of WISC from the start, as I have already hinted, I was willing to organize such a bit with the support of the German Political Science Association and Goethe University in Frankfurt. It was in Frankfurt that we held what was probably the first extended two-day strategic planning meeting with representatives of international studies associations from around the world. Among others, associations were supportive of the idea to explore options for formally registering WISC as an association itself. And 3 years later, or to be precise, on 26 January 2017, we had finally succeeded in completing the registration process with Swiss authorities. In this context, I'm particularly grateful to Marc Boyer, Stefano Guzzini, and Thomas Dietz, standing in as representatives of ISA, EISA, CESA, the Central Eastern European International Studies Association, and ISA, the International Studies Association, to formally assist in the founding process of WISC with Swiss authorities. As far as the founding process itself is concerned, I am particularly grateful, Knut-Erik Jørgensen, to you, because you helped tremendously in drafting the WISC constitution based on the EISA example, which you had coordinated in registering as a president of EISA just a few years beforehand. And without you, I think I wouldn't have succeeded in just getting stuff together ready for signature with Swiss authorities. 2017 was also an important year for WISC besides registering as an association, because we finally succeeded in organizing WISC's first global international studies conference outside of Europe, where all previous conferences had taken place. We are grateful in particular in this context to our colleagues in Taiwan, who were great hosts indeed for our first conference in Asia. Preparations for the sixth Global International Studies Conference were a bit more complicated because the Mexican Association withdrew its offer to host the 2020 conference on very short notice in May 2019. This is actually the only disappointment during my tenure at the helm of WISC, which I have to register. And I'm particularly sorry in this particular context and want to apologize to our Brazilian colleagues who had submitted an equally competitive bid to be hosts in Belo Horizonte. Yet for understandable reasons, Arie, the Brazilian International Studies Association, could not stand in on such short notice because preparation time was much too short, besides the fact that the election of President Bolsonaro complicated the political situation in Brazil. Against this difficult background, the governing board of WISC was extremely grateful, in particular to colleagues in Argentina, in particular the team at Catholic University of Argentina in Buenos Aires, Professors Ariel Gonzalez Levaggio, Andrea Oelsner, and Melissa Lizano. Andrea is, I think, in the room. I don't know where the other two are. Our local organizing team in Buenos Aires for being willing to organize the 2020 conference on extremely short notice. By the end of 2019, in less than half a year, we had collectively succeeded in having everything in place for our first global international studies conference in Latin America, which was scheduled to take place in July 2020. The pandemic hit, as all of you know, and so we also had to postpone the July 2020 meeting in Buenos Aires in early 2020. Today's first virtual Global International Studies Conference of WISC has been organized in a sense as the culmination of our activities during the pandemic so far. And my special thanks for organizing it all goes to the program chairs of this conference, all related activities to the 2020 and 2022 conferences, Professor Arie Kacowicz and Professor Andrea Oelsner, the program chairs. I really hope that this experience provides a taste for what will happen next year when we hopefully can really meet in Buenos Aires as originally planned. This leads me to my final thanks, since none of this would have been possible without my colleagues in the governing board of WISC, who have been extremely supportive throughout the past 4 years. Let me mention in particular Roberto Dominguez as executive secretary, Karina with the second unpronounceable last name, as Arie mentioned in the beginning, as treasurer. Thank you, Karina. And our 3 officers in the first governing boards, Arie Kacowicz, Arlene Tickner, who I think is present via audio at least, and Nassef Madabilang Adyong, our most recent addition to the governing board. Although he bears no responsibility formally in the governing board, Isaac Flores Delgado has already been mentioned. And you all see and realize today and have noticed over the years that none of what you see about WISC around the globe on the website, whatever emails you receive, none of this would be possible without Isaac. So a special thanks, Isaac, to you as well. Given this team, I'm very confident that WISC is well placed for the next year. Thank you very much. Good luck to all of you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gunther, and right on time. And thank you for the very kind words to all of us. We are the team. I never thought about WISC like the UN, but that's an interesting metaphor and comparison to continue the conversation. So without further ado, I want to give the virtual floor, the yellow floor or the yellow square, to our incoming president just in a few hours from now, Professor Pinar Bilgin. Pinar, you have the podium.
Okay, thank you. So it is my moment to say thank you as president-elect of WISC. Now, this word elected president makes me sit up and take notice. Of course, I'm grateful for the support that was shown yesterday. But for those of you who don't know, the election process for presidency takes the form of consultations, right? With member organizations, and then a nomination, and then the president is elected without actually as the only candidate. Now, I understand that this is standard practice, right? But this is not a practice that I would want the world of politics that we analyze would learn a lot from. This is a dream process for many presidents in our world of world politics would like to emulate, to adopt. Let's hope that this stays a dream for as many of them as possible. Now, leadership is always a challenge. I find it especially a challenge. I'm not a natural leader really, and have to work at it. So the reason why I hesitated when Gunther initially approached me to assume the presidency of WISC, it has to do with that mostly. But he convinced me that WISC has a lot of, although it does not really have a lot of resources available, right? Or a set of practices to fall back on, as some of our other institutions, it relies on the energy and goodwill and professionalism of the people who are involved, and you've already heard their names this evening. So when Gunther initially approached me regarding this position, I hesitated. It is an honor, of course, needless to say. But my concern was that I will not be able to do justice to such an important job. He reassured me that WISC already has a very strong team in place in the persons of Karina and Roberto and Isaac, right? And that did a lot in terms of allaying my concerns. This is a team effort, right? And the other members of the team are experienced enough. So you're in good hands in that sense. And we have a very good and strong governing board. Names have already been mentioned to collaborate with and for me to learn from. Again, very committed, very professional, and always willing to help out. Now, we had these conversations in pre-pandemic times. Our agenda at the time when we had this conversation, and I remember having this conversation when I was in Rio for a brief time, and Gunther called me and we had a lengthy conversation. Our agenda at the time was made up of two items, both regarding the global conference. The Buenos Aires conference, which I learned at the time was in excellent hands and remains to be so, right? And the next conference, which was looking for in search for a host and a venue at the time. 2 years on, we're in the same place, right? The Buenos Aires conference remains to be in good hands. And we are very grateful, as Gunther said, and let me add to that, we're grateful for the commitment of our hosts in Buenos Aires. And we are equally grateful for the commitment of our program chairs and the local organizing committee, right? And even more grateful for our colleagues who stepped in, assumed the responsibility for organizing our first virtual conference as well. So let me add to Gunther's thank you to all of you. Now, it's very tempting to say that this is our first and last virtual conference, but that is only partly up to us. This is a conversation perhaps for the future, but we will be grateful for your feedback if you have been able to attend our panels so far or after this regarding this format. This is exceptional for bringing people together, and we may seek to make use of it in the future, not because we have to, right, but because we choose to. So we'll be very grateful for your feedback regarding this in different ways, of course. So let us keep the conversation going about this. Okay, now I made a lengthy introduction as I prepared to say thank you to Gunther. Leadership is always a challenge, I began, and Gunther assumed the leadership of WISC at a crucial moment, which he did not really say much about. Those of you who were closely involved at the time with WISC would know that WISC was in a fragile place at the time, and its future was not that certain. He rose up to the challenge, and after a very successful Frankfurt conference, which studied the waters for WISC, he moved to institutionalize, and that is what he was referring to here. WISC remains a network of professional associations. As it is in the title, it is a committee, but it is not a loose network of associations any longer. After Frankfurt, and we had another successful conference, this time in Asia, in Taipei, right, which cemented, I think, WISC's place, among others. And I think it also clarified WISC's place among other conferences, and there are many other conferences, and this is something that I'm going to come back to later in the panel as well. It is under Gunther's leadership as well that WISC has started to organize workshops. This is, I think, worth mentioning. One group of workshops that WISC organizes is the kind of workshops that we already know by the examples of ISA or EISA, right? That run before the global conference in a known kind of format. There are the others who are co-hosts, but WISC brings in some of the funding. But it's the early career researcher workshops I'm wanting to say more about today. This is not a WISC invention. Standing Group on International Relations used to do this for PhDs, young scholars. But WISC, I think, has played a key role in rendering these workshops global. I took part in the New Delhi, the Goa, and the Prague workshops, and the virtual one that ran in May, just about a month ago. My job, together with other colleagues, was to provide feedback to papers and offer mentoring if invited. It's through WISC's ECR workshops that we got to know two of our younger colleagues who are going to be speaking on the panel later today. They would be able to tell you what difference WISC workshops, early career researcher workshops, has made for them. And their input would be very important for us in thinking about locating WISC in the post-pandemic world. Okay, I say post-pandemic in a kind of optimistic sense. Okay, so I made another detour. I was thanking Gunther, and I made another detour. If you're it is these kinds of workshops are wonderful. I wanted to note for those who are attending, but also for the hosts as well. You know, we learn by example as well, where we learn when others receive feedback. So it's wonderful for our own PhDs when we host such workshops to learn by the example of others. So I encourage you to consider co-hosting some of those with us. Okay, so thanks to Gunther and our colleagues who worked very closely with him, WISC is in a very strong position at the moment. Our challenge then, as I see it, has to do with, of course, continuing with this already strong foundation that Gunther is leaving with us, but also what is important for our purposes is to keep having conversations about this. It's very important for you to give us as constituent associations, but also as scholars, to give us feedback in terms of where do we go from here. As I said, our challenge, as I see it, has to do with locating WISC in the post-pandemic world. In the short term to medium term, I'll say more about this. This overlaps with the questions that Arie has sent us, which he's going to say more about in a moment's time. So I'll conclude now by thanking for Gunther's leadership, expressing my appreciation and gratitude for all of our colleagues who were already named, who have been involved in helping make this transition, helping institutionalize WISC. And I look forward to working with all of them and all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pinar. And again, both of you have been very, very disciplined. So according to the program, I don't know whether there is anybody in our virtual audience that would like to pose a question to either Gunther or Pinar. No?
I'm not sure if it's the place for it, but if I may, on behalf, well, having worked with Gunther and looking forward to, for the next 2 years at least, to work with Pinar, I would like to thank Gunther for cooperation, because, sorry Pinar, but for me, since I joined the first WISC meeting in 2016 at the ISA conference, I associate WISC with Gunther. It's now so it will take some time to get used to, but now thank you, Gunther, for the last 4 years we've been working together. Looking forward to working with you, Pinar, and actually that's it. I feel very privileged being part of this community. Of course, thanks a lot to other people that make it possible, like Arie, Arlene, Nassef, and of course, Isaac. Thanks a lot.
Karina, I think WISC should consider itself lucky that you are spared 16 years, like Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel. So I have to be out after 4 years maximum. Thank you. And anyhow, thank you, Karina.
Are you going on vacation tomorrow morning, Gunther, after WISC? I'm confessing, I'm flying to Rome for a wedding for 3 days. My first travel since 1.5 years. Well, that's a first. Okay, so thank you very much, both of you. So we'll move to the second part of this global meeting, global town meeting. And what we are going to have now, and we have about 1 hour and 15 minutes to engage in that. We'll try to suggest a roundtable. The title is a bit ambitious. It's not the international around the globe that Andrea and I, we are keep postponing right from year to year. Hopefully it will take place in Buenos Aires next summer. So the roundtable is entitled WISC and the Globe, Achievements and Challenges. So let me tell you very briefly the rationale and the questions, and then I want to introduce, we have actually 5 panelists. I already introduced Pinar and Gunther, so I will introduce the rest of our very eminent panel members, that it's a combination of experienced, more experienced and less experienced scholars, we are part of the same family. So again, the title, which was also originally the title of this virtual conference, refers, and it's kind of ambiguous, right? So it fits us as scholars, right? When we talk about WISC and the globe, achievements and challenges, so I can think about 4 possible questions that we are going to pose to our 5 panelists. And then as politicians, you can choose among the 4 questions, because the idea is that in Zoom, everything goes much faster. So around 5 minutes or so. So you can address achievements and challenges of WISC, that we hear that partially, or we hear that quite a lot from Gunther and Pinar. You can refer to achievements and challenges regarding the globe, right? We are now trying to exit the pandemic, moving from alpha to delta, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but you can reflect on that, on the achievements and challenges of the global. A third possible question, maybe you want to link, as Gunther, you were linking between the UN and WISC, right? You want perhaps to link between WISC and the global. And the fourth question, it's the classical question from the New Testament, quo vadis, right? Where are we heading in these turbulent times, paraphrasing the late James Rosenau. And to address those 4 questions that remind me the 3 questions that Thomas Riese asked in the previous session on the liberal script, so we can spend hours. So we have a panel, as I mentioned, of 5 eminent colleagues. You know the first, you know number 1 and number 4 in that list. According to the order of the program, the first colleague would be Pinar, the fourth would be Gunther, and in addition to the 2 of them in that order, so, and I want to introduce them very briefly. We have Professor Arie Buzan from the London School of Economics from the United Kingdom. We have Professor Yvonne Chiu, if I pronounce that correctly, from the US Naval War College, Newport, USA. And we have Dr. Sashi Sundaram, and I will introduce them, as I mentioned, briefly. With Arie, I'll try to be brief, right? So I'm borrowing from the website from the London School of Economics. Arie Buzan is an emeritus professor of international relations at the LSE. You were before the Montag Burton professor, honorary professor at Copenhagen, Jilin China Foreign Affairs University, senior fellow at LSE Ideas, a fellow of the British Academy, a project director of the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute from 1988 to 2002, 1995-2002 research professor of international studies at the University of Westminster, and it keeps going. Arie Buzan was the chairman of the British International Studies Association, the vice president of the ISA, and the founding secretary of the International Studies Coordinating Committee, 1994 to 1998. And he has written, co-authored or edited, and I guess that the list keeps growing since I'm reading that, over 25 books written or co-authored, nearly 150 articles and chapters, lecture, broadcasts, or presented papers in over 20 countries. So for some of us, like Galia and me, that we are fans of the English school, we are not only the eminent professor of the English school, but you keep writing books and articles at an incredible pace in the post-Anglo-American hegemony area. So I don't know how to explain that. Maybe you'll try to do that in your 5 minutes. In that panel, in our panel, we have Professor Yvonne Chiu, if I pronounced that correctly, Yvonne, if not correct me. So Yvonne is a political theorist and writes on just war theory, international ethics, and authoritarianism. She taught at the University of Hong Kong until 2017, now teaches at the US Naval War College, and she's a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Her 2019 book, Conspiring with the Enemy, The Ethics of Cooperation in Warfare, won awards from the ISA and the North American Society for Social Philosophy. Last but not least, and I'm happy to meet Sashi today and realize that we have common interests. So Dr. Sashi Kumar Sundaram, or Sashi Sundaram, he's a postdoc fellow at the postdoc researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He completed his PhD at the Central European University. I don't know whether he's still in Budapest or moved to Vienna. His research focused on global order and global south, liberalism and empire, foreign and security policies of India, Brazil, and China in a comparative perspective. And he managed to publish articles in very prestigious journals like International Theory, ISQ, Journal of Global Strategic Studies, Journal of International Political Theory and Policy. So without further ado, each of you will start with Pinar, move to Arie, then to Yvonne, then to Gunther, and finally to Sashi. So you have about 5 minutes. If we want to take 7, we can bargain about that, but no more than that, to speculate and refer to any of those 4 questions. You can add your own speculations, and then we'll take it from there, okay? So Pinar, again, back to you.
Thank you. Now, of the 4 questions that Arie asked us, I'll speak about the achievements and challenges of WISC. I'll talk about achievements that are realized and that remain potential. But let me begin by with the challenges. I see short and medium-term challenges, as I said a moment ago. The short-term challenge is about organizing a global conference at a time when vaccination is not yet a global effort, and travel is disrupted in different ways in different parts of the world. And being a global entity, this is something that we as WISC need to consider more closely than our individual associations. Local associations naturally focus on, if not prioritize, their own corner of the world. So our challenge at WISC is different. We can't really afford not to think globally about this challenge, and we'll need creative solutions in the coming years. So as I said before, please let us think together about this, reflect on the experiences from today, but also from your local associations, and let us learn from each other. Okay, that's the short-term challenge. The medium-term challenge, and I'm going to say more about this, is about WISC's place in the world, locating WISC in the world. How do they envision its role in the future? This is a question I would have asked even in the absence of the pandemic. I think it is important to ask ourselves every now and then, what is the value added of yet another institution, yet another conference, yet another journal? You can add to this. Let me put this more frankly, perhaps, than is necessary. The ISA remains to be the place where we have scholarly conversations about globalizing IR, an effort that I've been a part of, and many of those who are some of those in the room have also been a part of. Have to give credit where it's due. If it was not for the ISA, I would not have got into thinking about the project of globalizing IR. It was a workshop. Arlene is here in the room. Ule is not with us at the moment, but a workshop focusing on geocultural epistemologies that got me thinking about this issue in the first place. That was, of course, the beginning of my thinking. It was not the beginning of thinking worldwide, I should note, but ISA played an important role in getting us going. A second milestone, of course, belongs to the ISA as well. Amitav Acharya's presidency, his choice of global IR as a theme, put globalizing IR on the map of many others. I was one of the program co-chairs together with our late friend and colleague, Lily Ling. And she is one of those people who had by then thinking about the questions surrounding globalizing IR for a while. So I wanted to mention her name, albeit in passing. Now, I say globalizing IR as a placeholder for a better term that I have yet to come across. What I mean by globalizing IR is the effort, a conscious effort from the 1980s onwards, to render international relations more reflective of the ideas and experiences of the world that it seeks to make sense of, right? ISA remains to be the conference that we go to have these conversations, to have these discussions about globalizing IR. And the reason I'm talking about the ISA when addressing a WISC audience is because I think WISC is where globalizing IR should also be taking place. It is not yet that place. So this is a potential, I think, that is yet to be fulfilled. WISC, I think, is the ideal place to have these conversations. What Vivian Jabri and Karim Firki refer to as global conversations, and I'm borrowing their term here. The way to do this, I think, is not to organize yet another panel, plenary, series of workshops on globalizing IR, but to have global conversations on anything and everything that we do in our everyday lives, right? Global conversations about anything and everything that we do in our everyday lives. As professionals, I mean, not, everyday lives. The panels that I've attended to so far, earlier today, were global in terms of participation. They were global in terms of questions being asked by the scholars. They were in no way parochial. Whether they were global in terms of the literature that was being referred to, the discussions that were being engaged with, there's more of a mixed picture there. This is, I think, a challenge for all of us in international relations, myself included. Those of us who's seeking to globalize IR or merely interested in what is going on under this title, let us check with which panels that we attend when we go to conferences. Is it to yet another conference? Is it to a panel where yet another conference, where yet another core scholar is speaking about the need for globalizing IR that we go to and listen to? Or does your list of panels to attend to include a panel by non-core scholars addressing the same topic, right? Or is it a panel by non-core scholars addressing some global problems so they're not speaking about their part of the world, but about the international. So here I clearly do not mean locals speaking about their own problems only. That is not the point here at all, right? I clearly do not mean those interested in one part of the world attending a panel by scholars speaking about that part of the world, right? That's area scholars speaking amongst themselves. This is a very valid conversation, of course, but it does not get us very far in terms of globalizing international relations. It does not get us very far in terms of globalizing IR if local scholars remain in the position of informing their local setting of the world of IR and informing the rest of the world about their own setting. Okay, a dual role. In terms of the state of international relations around the world, this is a changing story, I know, but changing very slowly. And I think WISC can play an important role in changing the pace of this change. Not just in terms of conference attendance, I have to say there is a challenge here, but in terms of our own scholarship as well. Right? Those of us who are actively seeking to globalize international relations, let us check our footnotes. Who do we read? Who do we write footnotes to? Do such references go beyond cursory references to Fanon, to Spivak, to Said? However important those references are, it is also important to be aware of non-core scholars who are our contemporaries, who engage with the same questions that we engage with. We can only globalize IR if we start thinking of ourselves as having a conversation that is global. WISC is an important place, I think, to have such conversations. And our job in the future is going to be thinking about how to have those conversations more effectively, right? Because what I observed at the ISA conferences to a certain extent exists in the WISC format too. Whose panels do we go to? Who do we engage with, right? If we have room for development there as individual scholars or as professional associations, what can we do to realize this potential that WISC has? In my own experience as a student of international relations, the achievement of WISC has been to drive home the lesson, the need for such conversations. I understood by attending WISC conferences that there isn't any such a need. the need for such conversations if we are to go beyond declaring the need for globalizing IR and actually getting on with the job of globalizing it. The challenge, I think, is to think creatively, think about creative ways of doing what we do within the WISC format. And as I said, I look forward to your input regarding that. I'll conclude here before I make Arie more nervous. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinar. 7 minutes, it's also fine, and it's very engaging. So we move to Barry Buzan. Barry.
Thank you, Arie. I'd like also to extend my thanks to Gunther for everything he's done, and to Pinar for everything that she's going to do, and for taking on the burden. I'm going to look forward a bit, but mainly I'm going to look back, since I'm the old guy in the room here. I guess that's my kind of role for this session. But I do agree very much with what Pinar just said about seeing WISC as a place in which global IR needs to be discussed. It seems to me that WISC is already doing global IR. I mean, you just have to look at the screen in front of you to see that. And more importantly, it is symbolizing global IR in the way that it is put together as a federative organization. That leads me to kind of look back, because IR is a very peculiar field in the sense that, unlike most academic disciplines, it has been, right since its founding, extremely Western dominated, and within that, extremely Anglosphere dominated, for all kinds of reasons that are easy to understand. But nonetheless, it's a very odd starting point, and it has a long legacy. And I mean, ISA has been mentioned several times here, and I'm going to mention ISA as well, because I think ISA is part of that legacy. And as many of you have indicated, it's both a problem and an opportunity. It's a problem because it's the elephant in the room. That, you know, the ISA has always had a lot more members and a lot more money than anybody else. It's very notable that its name, ISA, is not the American ISA or the North American ISA. It's just ISA, right? So there's a pretense there that that organization either should be or could be not just the North American International Studies Association, which I see it very much as, but the global one. And as many of you have suggested, ISA has played that role in many respects. It is the place where the conversation about global IR is mainly going on. Hats off to Amitabh for getting that rolling. But the ISA sometimes has been very facilitative of global IR, but there's a continuous danger in it, which I mean, I encountered in the 1990s when the ISA was in somewhat imperial mode and was trying to become the global ISA. And that seemed to me and John Groom and others, you know, very much the wrong way to go. America was already too dominant in the discipline, and we didn't want the American organization to be the global organization. That had all kinds of implications, some of which would be good because it was a competent and well-run organization, but some of which would be bad in the sense that it represented the continuation of this Anglosphere dominance. And it also carried with it the particular American approach to international relations, which is very closely related to political science, which is not the case in many other parts of the world, as many of you will know. So this, it seemed to me, is a difficulty. It's a difficulty for WISC because it has to deal with that, and WISC hasn't the numbers and it hasn't the money that ISA does have. But it does seem to me, and again, congratulations to Gunther on this, that I mean, WISC has done the job of standing up as an alternative to ISA. And if we're going to think seriously about global IR, and I think all of us are increasingly thinking seriously about global IR, then it does seem to me that the representative organization for that should be federative. Right? I can't get around that. I can't think of any other way of doing it. And I still think it would be a terrible idea if ISA played that role, right? Because the discipline is becoming more and more global. There are more and more people from more and more countries doing IR in one way or another and thinking about IR in a more global way, because the tradition in IR has been extremely West-centric, partly because of its origins. So it seems to me that this is the niche for WISC, that it needs to emphasize this federative quality as being, in a sense, the representative of global IR, and to make as much of that as can be done. It seems to me that the zeitgeist, if you like, is going in that direction. Right? That initially, I mean, the world was a Western world, and it made a certain sense that IR spoke for that and about that. I mean, up until the Second World War, the idea of colonial studies was separate from IR because those were seen to be a different order of relations. So we've come a very long way from that, and we're still going in that direction. And from that point of view, it seems to me the zeitgeist is going in the direction of WISC rather than in the direction of ISA. That there's a general anti-hegemonic feeling around, which in my view means that nobody wants anybody to be the leading force. It's a very egalitarian kind of sentiment that's emerging here. And I think WISC can build on that, and that ISA is going to have more and more difficulty dealing with that. So to my mind, looking forward, that's an interesting dynamic. I think I'll end with the note, and maybe Gunther wants to pick this up, because I know he's dealt with this to some extent, but I don't know where things stand now, which is that as a federative organization, there is a real difficulty bringing in outfits. I'm thinking particularly of China here, where the way of organizing things, to put it mildly, is not the same as it is in Western democracy. And WISC represents a kind of democratic way of doing things, but the Chinese do not have academic associations in the same sense that most of the countries represented in WISC do. So how do you understand the status of those organizations, and are there kind of awkward political questions about bringing them into to an organization like this? Those are some of the difficulties in front of us, but I do think the federative idea is the right one, and I think happily, in a sense, the zeitgeist is going in that direction and making that increasingly relevant. Thank you.
Very much. So we get another perspective. Yvonne Chiu from the U.S. Naval War College. Yvonne, you have the virtual square, floor, podium, whatever. Yvonne.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's a great honor to be here and to be able to talk to you guys. The caveat is, of course, that the views are my own. I do not represent the US government in any way, despite working for the Naval War College. So I want to start with saying that as a participant in 2 of the early career workshops, I personally have benefited greatly from the generosity of WISC and its leadership, including Gunther and Pinar. And I'm very grateful for not only the time and the careful attention of everybody who was involved in those workshops, which helped me finally get my book out, but also the people that I met there. And I see that several of them are also here today. I was educated in the US, but at the time of these workshops, I had been teaching in Hong Kong for several years. And when I was there, it was interesting to see how much Anglo and American approaches dominate international studies, but also how necessarily limited they are in understanding and addressing and often even identifying problems and concerns of those outside of the Anglo and American perspectives. I think despite the emerging egalitarian zeitgeist that Barry just mentioned, the reality is that there will always be hierarchies and there will always be dominant perspectives. But it's still important to try to bridge that gap. And WISC takes on that a special challenge of facilitating underrepresented perspectives in a really meaningful way. But it's tough work. as you know, Gunther and Pinar know, and these benefits will emerge, I think, only slowly. They'll only become evident over time. So it takes patience and a lot of labor and a very long view of the world. So I personally have been very grateful to have benefited from that. With the rest of my time, I want to say just a little bit about you know, a couple of the other questions, the challenges for the globe, and maybe connect it a bit to Wisk's concerns. So specifically, I'm just going to talk a little about authoritarianism. Throughout this century, there have been a lot of concerns about democratic backsliding and the return of authoritarianism, and especially in times of turbulence, whether it's, you know, displacement from globalization or a pandemic or wars. What seem like the steady and decisive hand of strong authoritarian leadership, it can be very appealing. And this is dangerous, especially in the Anglo-American world. I think it sometimes seems as if we're discovering this danger for the first time, because we've generally forgotten how recent our authoritarian past is. But in truth, there are seeds for authoritarianism and totalitarianism in every single culture. And I think these challenges are useful reminders to the so-called global north about the fragility and tenuousness of liberal democracy. There is no teleological progression towards liberal democracy. And this should also remind those who already have liberal democracy that they not only have to fight to keep it, but even as they're struggling, they serve as touchstones to the rest of the world for the value and desirability of liberal democracy, whether they like that or not. And forgetting how appealing authoritarianism and stability can be, and how much liberty people are willing to trade for security, even people who already live in liberal democracies. I think this is an example of how the global north can dominate a conversation. I think the global north would prefer not to come to terms with the appeal of authoritarianism to their own people. It would prefer to consign this to being a problem for less developed countries, but it's not. And so the dominant perspective can also be blind to the structure that often exists in disorder, right? Everybody who's ever driven a motor scooter in a developing world megacity, they understand this. There are no traffic lights, but everyone learns how to navigate the gaps. It's kind of like fish swimming in a school. And so the global south can challenge dominant narratives in both good ways and bad. For example, the dominant powers write international law. They dictate the norms and discourse of international military ethics and military norms. But this comes with costs. For example, the contemporary law of armed conflict. It privileges established and recognized nation states. It privileges their formal militaries by imposing certain costly and risky requirements, including wearing uniforms into battle with a few exceptions, refraining from attacking vital civilian resources, requiring certain standards of living for prisoners of war. And these impose burdens on poorer states, on non-state political organizations. It can exclude non-state actors by trapping them in legal limbos and leaving them without legal protections. But we also wouldn't necessarily want to overthrow the existing order either, right? Even as strong states frequently try to break the law, even strong states frequently try to break the law. And this is because there are lots of advantages to doing so. The law can still constrain you, and it's not simply a tool for the strong to oppress the weak. Because whatever their origins, once they're established, certain types of laws can be used to hold others to account. They can take on a moral life of their own. They can command obedience, even when they're detrimental to your own immediate interests. And so if we've learned nothing else this past decade, I think it's that the world can't always rely on dominant powers to take the lead in fighting authoritarianism and oppression. There are not only, I think this raises the possibilities, but also an imperative for coordination between smaller nations of all sizes, between less dominant nations, alternative alliances, possibilities for effective multilateralism at all levels. And this has to be a global effort, because when you have authoritarianism anywhere, I think it really does threaten the possibility of humanity in every place. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It's a really interesting perspective. So we turn now to Gunther.
Well, Thank you. This is extremely inspiring, and I'm grateful to all of you joining the discussion here on the panel, Pinar, Barry, Yvonne, Sashi, because you're raising the kinds of topics that I think we indeed, in what Pinar, with reference to Karin Firke and what's your first name, Jabri, the two of them call the global conversations in their article. I think that, I want to just underline that point that Pinar and Barry have been making, because that has been one of my leading ideas in getting involved and trying to move forward with WISC from the very beginning. I see that besides Knut Erik and a few others, I see that Tom Volji joined us in the room, understandably in the background, without microphone, camera, etc. But Tom, since if you do listen, I mentioned you initially. I'm not sure whether you were in the room already, because you were critical also in the process of bringing WISC's role about as executive secretary of ISA. Hi, Tom. And Barry has been referring to ISA's critical role, critical in the double sense, as both an enabling force for WISC itself, but also, of course, as an association, a member association, a critical member association of WISC, which is also the one key reference point with which we as WISC in our institutional development have had our conflicts from time to time. And let me just, since we are here more or less amongst ourselves, and Knut Erik and I know that part of the history a bit better. Just recall that brief instance of where we, in Barry's description of the involvement of certain associations and the critical role that ISA plays, the potential role that WISC might play, have been, well, at least in sort of an institutional tension. And I think I can tell that story without making confidential stuff public. When Knut Erik and I sat down to think about what kind of institutional framework we should choose, how should we set it up constitutionally, and what name should we give this new beast, we, of course, I think Knut Erik and I thought, of course, this is the Global International Studies Association. But that very name caused quite some friction with ISA. And the things that Barry was referring to in his remarks, I think explain why that is the case. I mean, ISA, as we all know, and we all do go to ISAs regularly, ISA is the place when it comes to having the kinds of conversation that Pinar referred to in her contribution. And without ISA, a lot of things would not be possible. I mentioned it in my initial remarks. Without ISA, WISC's current constitutional form would not be possible, because Tom Volji, Mark Boyer have been instrumental in helping us to register as an association. But there has been always also this tension in terms of what Barry called the federative organizational form that probably an institution at the global level needs to have. And in that sense, we have had a few more difficult discussions between WISC on the one hand and ISA and its different leaderships on the other. I think we have always succeeded in turning that into a productive result. I think we all were, in the end, happy to keep the name that Barry, John Groom, and others thought out in the beginning, the World International Studies Committee, because in the end, the types of global conversations that you should have, as Pinar rightly said, it doesn't matter much whether it's a Global International Studies Association or just WISC, the name that this association had been given initially. I think that Barry also referred to an important point when he mentioned China. and Barry just hinted at it, and I can, because that is not confidential either, I can tell you that when we initially approached both China and Taiwan for possible membership in WISC, that was done at the same time and in parallel. We never received a response in 2015, 16 from anybody in China, and I tried several people. So unfortunately, there was no established link between Chinese IR, which is, as Barry hinted, very different compared to other associations globally. But we got an instant response from Taiwan, the organization there, and they were also willing, for understandable reasons, to be hosts. In the meantime, however, and I was traveling explicitly to the president. I'm not pronouncing Kim Jong-il's name rightly. Yvonne, you might be able to help me. I mean, he is the president of the Foreign Affairs University, I think is the name, and the person in China to go to when it comes to international relations. And we had an extended conversation in Beijing about Chinese IR in whatever form joining WISC, because I think Barry is right. In the kind of world we want, China has to be represented in the federative kind of structure that we have in mind, in spite of the problems that we probably will have as a result of that. But I think it goes along with Pinar's point about we have to have the kinds of global conversations in the kind of setting that does not have one association in sort of a leading role already institutionally. And as weak as WISC might be institutionally, it is, I think, the place to have. Maybe, Arie, how many minutes would I have?
2 minutes more.
Okay.
4 minutes.
I think what has been said, and I think I said that from the very beginning in 2014 when we met in Frankfurt. WISC's role, in my understanding, has always been to add value. We are an association of associations. We have no individual membership. We are therefore also poor. We are institutionally weak. We have no secure funding. The governing board is working on a self-exploiting basis, essentially. We keep funding operations from our chairs. I mean, that had been the case in the last few years, as far as me is concerned. There is no financial structure in that sense. We have, of course, some financial resources, but that is the result of other people being willing to self-exploit themselves by subsidizing global conferences, as in Taiwan, as in Ljubljana, as in Frankfurt, and possibly to the extent possible in Argentina next year. And this is, of course, a tremendous disadvantage compared to other associations. ISA is rich, and understandably so, given the professionalism that they display in their conferences. We cannot compete, and I think we should not compete in that regard. It's an association of association, and it should add value. And I'm really glad, Pinar, that you have emphasized those points in your statement as well, because that has been always my understanding. And this is also why we have been getting along with all members, essentially well in the end, with EISA, with ISA, with other associations which have been collaborating with WISC. And this is actually the basis of our success. We cannot work against members. We have to work with members. And if we are lucky, Barry, I think we can also get them on board for the kinds of federative initiatives that you were referring to. Last point, maybe a substantive one that links a bit to perhaps what Yvonne said, but also what Pinar said in terms of the substance of our subject matter. I've been doing a bit more stuff on the Anthropocene recently, and I think just that topic, which is of course well beyond classical international relations as we conceive it, just makes it plain that we have to come to develop perspectives on the subject matter of the international, the global, whatever you might want to call it, that tries to move beyond methodological nationalism. And that is sort of what I think, but Peter, you couldn't take a part in the Johannesburg workshop where we talked about teaching global IR or teaching IR globally. And we will have something coming out in that regard very soon, open access papers and syllabus, which are probably, or hopefully also inspiring for others. There are topics, huge topics, challenging topics, which I think are just beyond even our intellectual tools so far, which we have to deal with. And again, a global framework for that, like the WISC context would be suitable. Thank you, and sorry for taking too much time, Arie.
That's fine. Okay, last but not least, Sashi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gunther, and thank you, Pinar. I'll keep my sort of talk limited and limited to two sort of discussions. One is at an institutional level, reflections on the sort of challenges upcoming, and two, at the level of politics. And I'll be provocative just to have this conversation going in a particular direction. I think the biggest achievement of WISC was to champion global scholars from different parts of the globe into one network of academic environment. And I'm grateful for that. And I've attended the workshops, I've benefited from it, and I've also published because of it. And that is an important aspect of being part of WISC community. However, at the institutional level and in terms of reflection, I think with problems and lack of money, as Gunther points out, the challenge is to transform WISC, but by guarding it against WISC community itself becoming a community of elite corps. Elitism and classism is a hallmark of international relations. We know that people favor underdogs, but they only follow top dogs. I've myself done this in terms of publication strategies, in terms of the number of people I meet, greet, and have inspiration from. And in this sense, how do we guard WISC from becoming a community of elite, a community of entrepreneurs who come together and talk and have things published? And to get access to this community, you need to be part of another elite group in the global south. I think we need to break this cycle somehow. And WISC workshops are important, but it is the culture of peer reviewing that is much more sort of important in foregrounding how an academic paper gets published, how an article gets published, or a book gets published. What really happens here is that one or two or other scholars come together, they have an opportunity to discuss those articles and ideas with reputed scholars, get those tricks of the trade in terms of writing clearly, presenting the arguments clearly, and eventually publishing it. But I think the larger WISC idea is to generate this mini network of reputable peer reviewing without having reputed scholars within the network. And this I want to clarify because there are many sort of mini peer reviewing community in Brazil, in China, in India. But why is that when scholars meet a particular reputed scholars in a particular community, they're able to have things published? Is it the tricks of the trade in writing? Or is it a particular way of presenting the argument that kind of resonates with the larger sort of reviewing community? And unless we break this cycle, then WISC will also somehow, I'm afraid, transform into this elite community where you have to be part of in order to get reputable comments to be part of the reputed journals. And this is my sort of last reflection on the first part on the institutional level. And I agree very much with what Pinar said about having global conversations and what Arie also said in terms of anti-hegemonic thrust of global IR. But global conversations must focus on structure and it must not be a totalizing conversation. And this is the biggest challenge, how to distinguish between talking about the grand structures of international politics that is transforming the way we think creatively about substantive problems, at the same time not making these sort of grand thinking about global conversations into a totalizing conversations. And it is important then not to engage in interminable arguments about ultimate values of global diversity. That is the normative baseline. But how do we go from talking about structure without being totalizing is an important challenge, at least for the future leadership. Now, in the last 1 minute, I want to talk a little bit about the substantive problems, just to flag two important items at the political level. One, we are, at least in a particularly turbulent times where we see a lot of disenchantment in world politics. How is it that a future group of old and young disenchanted academics from IR will be able to contribute to the ongoing developments in world politics is a question. It is a question because academia is very distinct from activism. Academia requires some sort of skepticism, some sort of waiting to understand the world, whereas activism needs some sort of concreteness, some sort of dispelling skepticism for some time in order to make things done. And we saw this sort of activism we needed in order to challenge Orbán when he was trying to kick out CEU from Budapest. We saw this sort of academic activism, or activists in Brazil challenging Bolsonaro, or activists in Argentina, or activists in China, for example. But we also have academics in these institutions who would want to dispel this sort of challenge right away in order to wait and watch. And how far WISC as a community, or in terms of institutional community, can we afford to do this sort of distinction between academia and activism? I say this precisely because we know that India, Brazil, and China are engaging in massive human rights violations, both within the state and abroad. How far can we dispel our skepticism to these sort of problems in order to invite them to be part of community? We cannot do that. But if we cannot do that, we will not have money. But if we do that, then we are not academics, we are becoming activists, which is a different political agenda. And the next sort of problem, which I think is questions relating to individualism and solidarity. Much of international relations publications are individual, and it goes in my name or somebody's name, but solidarity has no name attached to it. And exercising solidarity to global IR or issues relating to anti-hegemonism does not need a particular name associated with it. And any sort of new sort of research industry that comes out is a particular individualistic contribution to global IR rather than a solidaristic contribution without names attached to it. And how is it that we are able to think about these sort of questions in a larger framework will be very important in order for us to think much more carefully about what will and where will we be in 5 to 10 years down the line. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those insights. So we have about a half an hour, and I want to bring our audience. We have to have a kind of a global town discussion, although we are not a large group, but we are, you could say, elite in the good sense. And again, there has been pretty much a consensus here. So let me just take 3 minutes just to summarize. I don't know where I can summarize, but just to get some of the points that some of you raised, referring to the 4 questions in the roundtable. So, Pinar, you referred, well, the short-term challenge is more of a logistical one that Andrea and myself and many of us, we are still dealing. I mean, we took this as I think, an intellectual venture that we have to fulfill, not 2021, so then 22. But the more long-term is this idea of the engaging in global conversation, right? And not just having that reflected in WISC, which is great in terms of I think we have here in this one conference between 30 and 40 different countries, okay? And I think that's the point you brought. Barry, you continue that line in the sense that the disciplines become more global and there might be a niche here for WISC to grasp as a kind of a federal organization. I think, Yvonne, you more reflected in the reality, right? Less on WISC and more on the reality. Some of your comments remind me of Robert Kaplan, The Coming Anarchy, right? Or maybe I'm exaggerating, right? About this interplay between the global South and the global North, and the global South can challenge the Northern narratives, but at a cost. I'm quoting you, right? Gunther, it's interesting that you talk quite a lot about this WISC-ISA complex relationship, but I think that in your remarks, you also refer to the big elephant, which is China, right? An institutional, but also as a reality. And I'm so happy that you had a conference in Taiwan. That's when I discovered not only Taiwan, but also WISC, right? And the second point about those global issues that we have to take this anthropocentric approach, right? When you were talking about the association of associations, maybe the metaphor for WISC should not be the UN, but perhaps the EU, but that's something to keep in mind. And finally, Sashi, I think you raised many interesting questions, right? Since you took actually only in 5 to 7 minutes, you refer both to the institutional and to the politics level, right? And you keep asking excellent questions, what to do about that. And I think questions that have to do with our profession, right? How to change the world. I think you brought in a very clear way the normative dimension, right? And the dilemmas we have without being intellectuals and skeptic and being activists, right? And how to bring solidarity when we tend to be very individualistic in our profession, right? So again, I'm referring to what you said as a platform to open that, right? And so let's move into engaging other colleagues. And I see our secretary, Professor Roberto Dominguez. Roberto, please.
Well, thank you very much for your enriching and quite interesting remarks. I would like just to keep the ball moving in terms of some of the challenges that we have, and also somehow where we stand regarding WISC. And one of the elements that caught my attention, I'm going to make 4 points. The first one is what I would call the simultaneous moving targets. And I recall the conference in Frankfurt that actually was one of the more diverse in terms of accents and colors. And I remember at that time that it was very clear for me that WISC had that value added of really building a bridge with many communities. As you know, in Frankfurt, there were generous scholarships for people coming from Africa, from Asia. And I guess at that point, WISC somehow found a niche. And I guess it was a great contribution. However, my concern, and this put this as part of the challenges ahead, is that ISA has moved very rapidly in the sense of reaching out the global south. All the regional conferences, all the debates between the caucus, the regions, and that's something that we have to observe. At that point, I guess that what Acharya brought up to the conversation of global IR, I guess it's quite interesting conversation with him. It was very interesting that it's not about the global south, it's about global conversations. And I guess that's the right direction of WISC in the coming years. But something to keep ahead is that as we are revisiting our mission, if you will, at the same time, ISA has moved really fast in reaching out the global south and created institutionalized dialogues. So this is something to keep in mind. The second point is that at the level of, we have to revisit the type of membership, and somehow our constitution allows us to move in a few directions, but still I guess that we can exploit the idea of the United Nations, or the Federation of National Associations. I may say that we have reached out, and also we know that some national associations could become part of WISC in the coming months or years. Indonesia is doing something interesting in this regard. Spain has been somehow present as well. Thailand also has some type of organization. Bolivia. And there are, I mean, all these national associations, there is a variety of structures. Some are very old, some are really new, and some others are consolidated. Just to give you 2 examples, in the case of Uruguay, I didn't know that they have an IR association for 20 years already, you know. But it's very small. Well, maybe we should call them, you know, to become part of this community. And in other cases, Peru is quite interesting. They are still very much in the diplomatic view of IR. They need help in order to create their national association. So I guess that still we have an open conversation, and there is too much to exploit in that regard. The third element, what I have observed in the past few years is that somehow this dialogue, we interpreted that there has been great progress. Many people around the screen have made great contributions in terms of studying IR from different angles. What I have seen is that perhaps we focus so much on the global south, but just global south. And this, although this was a great contribution, the problem is that we were isolating the global south, studying the global south as a separate entity. And I have heard in many conversations in the corridors of in our international meetings, I guess that somehow sometimes people in the global south don't want to talk with the global north, or people with certain methodological approaches don't want to talk with the others. I recall a former president of ISA that at some point mentioned, well, it seems that sometimes we the realists do not find a place in some associations and in some conversations. So I guess that in that regard, we can do more in order to avoid involuntary parochialism. And I guess somehow that bringing the global south has produced at some point self or internal dialogue, but not across different methodologies and different approaches. So I guess that this is something that we can exploit. And the fourth point that I would like to make is about that there are some issues that could be quite operational, perhaps something to think about. And it's not my idea. In the roundtable in ISA this year, the panel that we organized as WISC, one of the takeaways in my view was that there has been great progress from scholars in the global south. We have one of the members of our governing board has developed a name, a global name, for instance, and we know we have developed that community, but perhaps the flavor was that the bridges are not there. That somehow someone in that roundtable mentioned that people are writing for reviewers in the global north. And someone mentioned an anecdote that at some point there was an excellent paper that it was somehow rejected or not rejected, it was a condition to the fact that needed to expand the authors in English, the big names. So this is something that I guess we can somehow contribute. And I guess that one of the operational elements that we can somehow think about is presenting research that brings different languages, that brings people from different corners, and somehow looking at the footnotes, how we are building those communities. And I can tell that there is a vibrant IR community around the world. And somehow, because they have been lost in translation, their contributions are not present. And I guess this is where we can make a contribution. Thank you.
Okay, Roberto, and I'm glad that you joined the conversation based on your role, experience, and I might add even your kind of identity, right? Global, how would you say, north-south kind of link, right? Your background, where you work, etc. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes. Please, questions, comments. Maybe some of the panelists, they want to refer to each other's comments. I mean, since we have only 15 minutes, I want to bring other people. Yes, Gunther.
I would like to invite actually others to join.
Yes.
And if I may just address two individuals who I know have been linked closely with WISC history. I mean, Arie is in the room, Tom Volge is in the room. Tom really knows WISC's history much longer than I do. I think Barry and Tom are probably as long in terms of their memory as far as WISC is concerned as anybody here. And I just am curious, if I may, I mean, you need not respond, Tom and Arie, because you have been looking at things as they developed over the years from different angles, the external perspective. And I would really be curious and grateful if the two of you would share just your impressions and observations as far as the future development of WISC in contact with other associations is concerned.
If I could respond just very quickly to the future question, I don't know. I think everything is in flux right now. Most associations are in flux. Most groupings of associations are in enormous flux. From a standpoint now of an outsider, I'm looking at ISA and its need to have had a virtual conference because of COVID. The kind of financial costs associated with technologies involved in all of this. Looking forward to a future which is partly virtual, partly real, in person. Part of the problem relates to finances, part of it true, meaningful academic exchanges between people occurring not just at panels, but outside of panels, which is probably the real strength of most of these meetings, is our ability to interact with each other informally outside of the panel context. All of this is under enormous flux. And I think that kind of major potential restructuring creates great opportunities for WISC, perhaps for ISA as well, and enormous pitfalls. And if I were smart enough to tell you where the hell we were going to go from here, I would publish it and show it to everyone, but I can't. I just don't know how we're going to get there. I'm just still trying to figure out how my 11-year-old is going to get vaccinated. So that adds nothing except to suggest that I agree that WISC has played an important role in all of this. It was always awkward for ISA to promote a federation of ISAs under its own umbrella. And partly because we are not ISAs, we are a membership-based organization. And while we have always aspired to be a global membership-based organization and have gotten very far towards that goal, federating ISAs was not our mission. And in many ways, WISC was really instrumental in trying to create that kind of alternative. It is an incomplete task. It will always be an incomplete task. It will always be a moving target. But I think there's been much progress made over the last few years, and much to Gunther's work and to those who worked with him. That's about all I got to say early in the morning without enough coffee.
So nice to see you, Tom. So you refer to the fourth question. Fluid, it's like fluid, it's like Bauman, the world is fluid. That's what we can think about that, right? So, but those are really interesting observations. We can, think about us as work in progress, right? That's what we always say about our own work. It's work in progress. It keeps evolving. Thank you so much. Maybe Knut Erik, yes, you come next.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my internet connection here from Izmir is reliable. Let's see. Concerning achievements, of course, when you evaluate achievements, it always depends on where you put the bar. You can say that WISC is still alive, so that is an achievement in itself. WISC is also kicking and is kicking more than it used to be. So in that sense, it is has been a history of growth of more significance over time. And I know that Gunther is very sort of instrumental in this context. And I was very delighted to hear that Pinar is ready to take up the challenges of sort of continuing this history of growth. But if we compare WISC to other maybe comparable entities, then we can maybe critically say that WISC has not been that much more than a section in IPSA. And that is sort of in my view, a modest role. So concerning the challenges ahead of us, several of you have mentioned that WISC is, it used to be a rich organization And you could argue that it is kind of embarrassing that a global organization of organizations has not been able to put itself into a more sort of financial viable position. There seems to be all sorts of opportunities for global IR, not just to preach it. And that is something that really takes a lot of time. But as long as it is or remains to be sort of a slogan or something that is stated as an objective in the foreseeable future, then I guess it is again a limited achievement. So maybe WISC should aspire to become something similar to the British Empire, in the sense that the sun is never setting on WISC activities, that there's always a WISC activity ongoing, perhaps not 24/7, but at least a WISC activity every month or so around the globe, and with agendas that make sense to those people who convene. With present technological tools among those that we use right now, that would be possible, and without sort of very big financial costs involved. And I think if that level of activity would be achieved, then the need for talk about relevance, because people would practice global IR as they meet in whatever form that they do. In terms of not the normative but the cognitive, I think that, or it seems to me that the organizational dimension of WISC could be given sort of an upgrade. Again, in a journal based in Ankara, I made a plea to organize 100 workshops on theorizing IR around the globe. Of course, that never came to sort of an accomplishment, but imagine that people who are inclined to theorize were convened around the globe to do so. Again, that would potentially result in the self-indulgent self-image of representing global IR in a few corners of the world would have a chance to survive. So in other words, I guess with Alex Wendt, I guess WISC is what we make of it. Thank you.
Nice way to phrase that. WISC is what we make of it. The question is then, who are we, right? The national associations, the people here around. Okay, we have a few more minutes. If anybody wants to address any of the 5 panelists or the audience, I know that it's a kind of maybe we are reaching a kind of Zoom fatigue, right? I mean, we are now, for some of us, 6 hours into the conference. We have as a little advertisement, in 20 minutes, we'll continue, and actually the possibilities will grow, because we'll go from, now we have 1 panel, before we had 2, and now we are going to have 6 parallel panels, and we'll bring at least the Global South or the Latin American emphasis as we are moving west. So we are going to have several sessions in Spanish or Spanglish or Spanish and English you can choose from. So anybody else? And maybe we can take a few minutes of break. I know I need that. Anybody else? Oh. Yes, Gunther.
Well, well, I think, I mean, those on the panel should have an opportunity, if they wish, to just briefly mention a few things, because I think this was a tremendously helpful exchange that we had here. And I'm grateful to all of you who contributed it, because, I mean, we're looking into the future and what might happen, and there are lots of important suggestions being raised. I just want to make maybe one remark following up on both Tom and Knut Erik. I think we WISC can and should recall that the Constitution as it stands is open for different types of membership. It's not necessarily national associations. There is institutional membership in principle possible, which means that also the political issues that are probably touchy as far as China and Taiwan are concerned can be resolved politically vis-a-vis China by just emphasizing this is not necessarily a nation state-based association of associations. So the fact that Taiwan, an association that is associated with that country, is a member need not mean that this is a sort of state kind of recognition of Taiwan as an entity, which makes it complicated or impossible for China to join WISC as well. And this is related to the other points that I mean, Tom and Knut Erik were mentioning also. I love it, Knut Erik. WISC is what we make of it, indeed. And there's a lot potential here. The way that Tom also phrased the uncertainties, I think just are just immense. There's lots of opportunity, but also lots, I think that was Tom's term, pitfalls ahead in terms of sorting things out. Final point, Roberto and others in the board and I have been thinking about for some time about mobilizing the kind of funding that you, Knut Erik, rightly referred to, which actually should be there for something like WISC. I mean, UNESCO, whatever kind of body there is to sponsor and subsidize associations of associations that sort of have a legitimate role globally. That shouldn't be too difficult. It's a lot of work, and I'm not saying that that my successor or the governing board should just pick that up, because I know the reasons why I hesitated to pick that on, but it is, of course, or would be one road ahead in terms of just mobilizing the kind of resources needed. I stop.
Okay. So let me just thank the five of you.
Pinar, I think wants to say.
Yes, Pinar, yes, of course.
Thank you. Very quickly, Arie, I promise. Some response, some clarification, 3 very quick points, some coming from the panel, some from the audience. When I talked about global IR as globalizing IR as a concentration area for WISC, I did not mean this in terms of research topic, right? I think we're likely to have these conversations about the discipline, theorizing about theories, right? I think we're likely to have these conversations at the ISA or EISA. I expect this to be the case. I was talking about WISC as a place where we actually globalize the way we do international relations. Okay, whatever topic we may be studying, and I've attended panels on Indo-Pacific regional order, migration, conflict and peace studies, and the liberal order, the future of liberal order before now. And these are, the idea is to globalize the way we research these topics, not that we study what those of us who focus on this subject area study. So just that one clarification. The second thing is, and globalizing IR need not be to the exclusion of realism, right? This global IR is not an IR theory, right? It is not a critical IR theory either. It's a way of doing things, right? It's a way of setting up conversations, and those conversations could be about realism, the virtues of realism or the limitations of realism. But the idea is to have a global conversation about this. And thirdly, it's about refereeing and the process. It's interesting. I of course I need to clarify this as an associate editor of one of the ISA journals as well. It's interesting that we problematize these kinds of issues, right? But let's remember that the way that the world that we are responding to, that we're reacting to, the world that we're identifying the limitations of, is a world that has worlded us. We want to get published in those journals. We don't just say, okay, I'll go and get published in somewhere in some other journal. So let's also recognize that we're responding to something, we're reacting to something that we want to be a part of. So it's also interesting that we want to other options, but in a world in which our options are shared. This is something perhaps to also think about and theorize about. I wanted to just make these clarifications in case I was not clear the first time around, but it's very valuable to think about those things. And to all of you, if you would like to pursue these conversations further in terms of the ideas, please let me know, let us know, and we can talk more deeply about these. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pinar. I see in the chat, and you can read that, an interesting exchange between Galia and Arlene, and, I can use Galia's comment as a way to summarize it, to continue this conversation of practicing global IR, not just among us, but involving graduate students and younger scholars, right? Because that's the message. So there is still a lot of work in progress to do. So I want to thank all of you in joining us, and we still have two more sessions to go, 4 more hours. So let's take the break. So you are invited to leave the session, to stretch your legs, and we'll continue this in English or in Spanish in 15 minutes from now, okay? Thank you very much. Good luck, Gunther, after Whisk, and welcome to the club, Pinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arie. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.